Okay, so today we're going to talk about some of the leading Sephardic sages of the 19th to 20th century. Of course, we cannot encompass all of them today, but we'll touch on some of them. So, Haim Ovadia Somech is called. His last name is Somech because he was a Somech. He was one who grants semicha, and he, as tradition has it, that he was a descendant of Nisim Gaon, so part of a very prominent family. He studied under Rabbi Yaakov HaRofeh, to whom we have many references in the rabbinic literature of the 19th century, but not too many writings of him are left. He became the head of the yeshiva Midrash Abu Menashe, but also called Bet Zbeda, and it was renamed Midrash Bet Zilcha. So you speak to Iraqi people, they all remember the Midrash Bet Zilcha. I think I mentioned you before that my own great-grandfather was ordained by him and studied under him. His important responsa and rulings is published in a book called Zivhei Tzedek. Zivhei Tzedek literally mean sacrifices of righteousness. But some of the important teshuvot that are mentioned in this book are also discussed by Tzvi Zohar in his book Heiru Penei Mizrach. Is a book about Sephardic responsa. One of the probably most important teshuvot that he has there is about the mikveh, the question that he was sent from India, and people wanted to know if they could use the public water system for the ritual baths, for the mikveh, and he responded positively. That was a very important ruling that made it much easier for people to have a mikveh instead of relying on a direct collection of rainwater, which this is what is done today in America. Is a very complicated system of cisterns and pools. There's one pool underneath the actual mikveh and one pool to the side, and both have to be connected. You have to collect the water in a special way and to refresh the water. To build a mikveh in America could run up to $1 million if you do it from the ground up. According to Rabbi Ovadia Somech, everybody could have a mikveh at home if you just run the municipal water system into your house, and you have a receptacle of a considerable size called 40 se'ah, one that you could dip your whole body and it will be covered in water. That will be fine, be considered good as a mikveh. Now, the importance of this ruling is that it not only frees people to, it makes it easier for people to build a mikveh or to consider something to be a mikveh, but also when people are choosing where to live and they look for an area, for a neighborhood. In America today, if you want to live next to a mikveh, you have to find a prominent Jewish community. Usually it's next to the big clusters, LA, New York, Baltimore, Los Angeles. I mentioned that. That's where you could find a mikveh or Seattle. Then that is where you will find kosher mikveh. If you want to live in the Midwest or a place where there's not a big Jewish community, I know of stories of people who had to travel 2 and 3 hours, if not more, to get to a mikveh. And in one case, the wife of a chaplain who was positioned in Alaska had to fly with the military plane to the mainland to America to go to mikveh, like 12, 13 hours. Now that's cumbersome. Besides that, there's also the question of just privacy, that a lot of women don't feel comfortable to going to a community mikveh. They don't want other people to know. They don't want their children to know. And that makes it much more easier for them. Interestingly enough, there's another ruling by another great Sephardic Hacham, Iraqi Hacham, Rabbi Yosef Haim of Baghdad, is also known as the Ben Ish Hai, that also has to do with the mikveh. Before I go to tell you more about the Ben Ish Hai, I'll just tell you what is his ruling about a mikveh. That's a very interesting ruling. The main requirement for a mikveh traditionally was that the water in the mikveh will not be drawn by men, but rather they should come there naturally. So Rabbi Abdullah Somech said that as long as it comes from the river or from the reservoirs through a system of pipes, it's not called drawn by men. It's only if you actually draw it by buckets and bring it to the place that it is drawn water. But Rabbi Yosef Haim found a different solution. Back in the day, people could buy ice from ice factories. People would buy ice blocks. I even remember as a child in Yerushalayim, we would see a cart, a wagon with this is the 1960s, late 1960s, and early 70s. You could still see a wagon with a donkey selling ice blocks for people, ice boxes at home. So the Ben Ish Chai says you could fill up a tub with ice blocks, and then when it melts and it becomes water, it is not considered water drawn by humans because they came there naturally. You didn't place water in the mikveh, you placed ice. The ice naturally became water. In Los Angeles, there's one mikveh that operates according to that ruling, and that's the mikveh in the University of Judaism. It used to be called University of Judaism, now it's American University, I believe. So on Mulholland, that mikveh is built with that system in mind. Whenever there's a need to refresh the water, they put ice in there and they get new water. And it was built under the supervision of an Orthodox rabbi. Interesting to add in that whole context is that up until the 50s, many mikvaot in America, many mikvahs in America, would rely on the other teshuvah, that of Rabbi Abdullah Somech, that you could use the municipal water system for the mikveh. And that whole thing changed when rabbis came from Europe after the Holocaust, and argued that that this kind of mikveh is not kosher. And I think it's in general a part of a trend of the push for orthodoxy of American Judaism that happened after the Holocaust. And it happened for two reasons, which are actually one. One is that for the people who lived here and left maybe the old country between 50 to 100 years ago, the people who came from Europe and brought with them the old customs, in a way invoked in them some kind of nostalgia and belief that this is the true way of life. This is what my grandfather did. For some people, not for all. For other people, it was the opposite. The opposite effect. It was that of aversion. This is not what I want. But for other people, those European Jews looked like the genuine Jews, and they definitely promoted that ideology. The second is that rabbis who led communities in America over the decades, almost close to a century since European Jews started coming to America, they had to adjust to a changing reality. And it was done gradually. Whatever changes that were made in their lifestyle within the Orthodox community were done gradually, one step at a time. But the rabbis who came from Europe were unaware of that change. So for them, when they came, it was not a gradual change, but a shock of something that is completely different than what they were used to. So they went to war against it. In the case of the mikveh, the European Jews won. The last mikveh to hold against the attack of the European rabbis was the mikveh in Seattle. And eventually that also, it gave way because the rabbis kept saying that the mikveh is not kosher. The women who go there, their children will not be considered kosher Jews. A giyur, a conversion, which is done there, is not kosher conversion. And then they went even to say that the food certified by the rabbi who is in charge of the mikveh is not kosher, and it brought it down. And I see an interesting parallel. The reason I'm bringing it up, even though we're discussing Sephardic Jewry, and that's American and mostly Ashkenazi Jewry, is because similar processes happened within Sephardic Jewry. In Israel, it was Rabbi Ovadia Yosef who led that that campaign. That on one hand he said we could be more lenient than Ashkenazi rabbis because we follow the tradition of the Shulchan Aruch. On the other hand, he said we have to go back also to the strict rulings of the Shulchan Aruch and so ignore all the progress that was made in the last 500 years. That is there. Another place where I think we could see it much more emphatically is with the Syrian community in Brooklyn. That since the first Syrian Jews came to America, mainly in the 1910s, 1920s, they settled all over. They were in South America, in different parts of the states, but eventually most of them concentrated in Brooklyn. And as they settled down, they slowly made progress in terms of changing their lifestyle and adjusting to the American lifestyle. I'm not saying that their culture was primitive or anything like that, but rather there are certain things that they held certain beliefs and now they were changing. And in the 1990s, there was a very strong push within the community to go back more towards the ultra-Orthodox mentality. And I believe it's because in the that is the time in the 1990s that the last Jews of Syria were brought to America. I think it's in the tens of thousands of people. The last Jews who were left there. A couple of activists in the Syrian community in Brooklyn in New York, were able to broker a deal with the Assad regime, and thank God they brought all those Jews to America. So when those new immigrants arrived, the veterans who already lived in America, I know have second, third generation, were welcoming in terms of helping them settle down, but they looked down at them. They were called the banana boats. Because they're fresh off the boat. They're, people came speaking Arabic, not fully understanding the culture, but they integrated very fast. And a lot of their children now are, doctors, lawyers. They're working hard, but also they looked at a lot of things that happened in America with the certain community in Brooklyn and say, this is not the traditional way. This is not how we do it. And people, because of nostalgia and because of the strong conviction of the newcomers that this is the true way of Judaism, gave way, and you have this tilt back to the old way. So that's an important thing today. When you look at a society, you have to look into the influx of immigrants, or either the influx of immigrants, or sometimes the rise of one prominent rabbi, of one person who leads a campaign. In the American case of the mikveh, was this rabbi who came from Europe, and in the case of Israel, it was Rabbi Ovadia Yosef who led that campaign within the Sephardic community. Anyway, we're going to go now back to Rabbi Yosef Haim, the Ben Ish Hai. So, Rabbi Yosef Haim was a prominent rabbi. He was the leader of the community. He looked stately and very, very impressive, very imposing. People respected him tremendously. I heard from my grandmother who attended his speeches when she was a young girl. He passed away in 1909. So my grandmother was born in the early 1900s. She heard him as a little girl, and when she told me that, she was close to 100 years old. So I heard from a witness who was there. It's interesting. But I also know that my great-grandfather attended his drashot, and the speeches or the sermons that he would deliver to Shabbat would last hours in front of thousands of people. he would speak of Kabbalah, of Halakha, of Parasha, etc. He was also a prolific author. He wrote close or more to 70 books. A lot of them revolve around one verse, around one verse in the Tanakh that describes one of the generals of David, Benayahu ben Yoyada. Benayahu ben Yoyada is praised with the title Ben Ishai, the son of a living man, and that is the title of the most famous book of Rabbi Yosef Haim, and is named after it, Ben Ishai. His brothers were involved in commerce, and so they're a very prominent family. There is an interesting description of some of the things that he was involved in terms of managing the community affairs, in a book by Professor Yaron Harel, Between Intrigues and Revolution. I mentioned this book to you. I think it's an important book to read if you want to understand the rabbinate in the Ottoman Empire in the 18th, so the late 18th to the 20th century. But what we need to know about the Ben Ishai that it has an interesting mixture of scholarship on one hand and mysticism on the other. Meaning, here you have a rabbi who was steeped in Kabbalah. He wrote a lot about Kabbalah, and also interpreted Halakha from a Kabbalistic point of view. But on the other hand, he also read extensively the literature that came from Europe, including Haskalah literature. He was well versed in Hebrew. He wrote a book called Hukei Nashim, Qanun Nasa, or the laws of women, that, God willing, we'll discuss in the next course that deals with the image of women in Sephardic literature. That book was actually, when it was translated to Hebrew, it was doctored by the more orthodox rabbis who translated in Israel, and I hope to highlight some of the differences that they made, some of the changes that they made in order to sort of obscure the original intention of Rabbi Yosef Haim. For one of the things, for example, when he speaks about modesty, he suggests that it has to do with the time and the fashion, and that he says that European women dress differently today than they did in the past, and that is acceptable. However, when they translate this from Arabic to Hebrew, they drop the line that is acceptable, and they made it sound like it's a rebuke to the European women, and that is something that it cannot be supported, that to be the view of Rabbi Yosef Haim, both because of the Arabic text that we have in front of us, and also because of pictures from that period, including pictures of my family and other prominent Iraqi rabbis, where you see that the women were dressed in a very modern way, and without covering their hair, with short sleeves, or not fully clad the way it used to be in the Muslim world at the time. So that is an interesting development that happened with the writings of the Ben Ishai. But besides that, he is well learned in Kabbalah and in modern literature. In between, he is also connected to the Jews, the Iraqi Jews, who started settling all over the world already in the 1800s. Iraqi Jews went to the Far East, to China, to India, they got to Japan, Indonesia, Burma, all these places, and they all corresponded with him and asked him questions. One of the more famous questions that he got from India was a question about a machine called gari. Gari is the Indian name for a bicycle, and the Ben Ishai, or Rabbi Yosef Haim, dealt with this question. They wanted to know if one can use a bicycle on Shabbat. They also asked him, and that is something that shows us the kind of life that these Jews led in India, if they can be carried in the ladies were carried by their servants in what do you call it?
I think they call it rickshaw. I mean,
No, not a rickshaw. Rickshaw is on a bicycle, but it's
palanquin.
what?
Sort of a palanquin?
Could be a palanquin. It's on top of four people would carry her in a little booth that she's sitting on in, and so they wanted to know if it's allowed on Shabbat, and he answered positively. He also answered positively about the bicycle, and he went in depth to analyze the structure of the bicycle. He said there's no problem with it on Shabbat. Later on, a lot of rabbis disagreed with him, but for a very obvious reason, and then I call it the knee-jerk reaction. It's not based on halachic analysis, but rather on the feeling that this is inappropriate for Shabbat for some reason. As if on Shabbat you're commanded to be locked at home. So among the Ashkenazi communities, the widespread minhag, if you could call it such a practice, became to not ride bicycle on Shabbat. You know, by the way, that the bicycle were invented in Germany. That's the first bicycle were in Karlsruhe in Germany, and from there they spread throughout Europe. So when we move on with the discussion of bicycle, remind me to send you the article I wrote about that. People argued that when the Ben Ish Chai issued the permission to use a bicycle on Shabbat, he was not aware of the inflatable tire yet. They said he was riding above the rubber, the full rubber tire. But if he would have known that there's an inflatable tire that could be punctured on Shabbat and you might fix it, he would say that it's forbidden. Well, that's not true, because if you I checked the timeline, and when he wrote that, the inflatable tire was already in use, it was already a reality. And besides that, he very clearly says, you cannot forbid the bicycle for fear that they will break and you will fix them, because we don't make up new decrees in our time. We follow what the halakha says, and we don't have to invent new fears and concerns. Meaning is very practical, very down to earth. Is planted here in this reality. Another very important response of his, another halachic teshuvah that I've analyzed at one point, is the first in his series of rulings on marital issues. It's a book called Rav Pe'alim. It's Siman Aleph, and it's a very intriguing question. The question that was brought to him was by a man who confessed to have had an affair with a married woman years ago. So now that man regretted his actions, and he came to tell the rabbi what he did, and he asked the rabbi to teach him the way of repentance and what should he do for teshuvah, which was very common at the time. I mean, it still happens, not to the same extent, but from I would say from the 13th to the 18th century, it was very common that people would come to the rabbi and say, "Tell me what to do in order to atone for my sins." And it actually started in the Ashkenazi community, most probably because of the influence of the church, where the rabbis would not want to fall short behind the church, so they would tell people, you have to get lashes, you have to fast certain days, and so on and so forth. So the man came to the Ben Ish Chai, and he said that this is what happened to him. And now the question was this: according to Halakha, an adulteress cannot live with her husband anymore, even if there are no witnesses. I mean, so actually there have to be witnesses. But if it is confirmed that a woman has committed adultery, her husband cannot live with her anymore. So the Ben Ish Chai asked this question. Now that he knows from that man who came and confessed that this has happened in the past, and that that woman is an adulteress, does he have the obligation to go and tell the husband? So now it was not something that was going on. That was an affair that happened in the past. If it was still going on, I think that his discussion would be completely different. And probably would notify the husband to save him that not only transgression but the being betrayed on a regular basis. But the way Rabbi Yosef Haim posits the question tells us about his approach to halakha in general. He says the following: it is true that according to the law, to the Jewish law, I must notify the husband that his wife cheated on him and that he cannot live with her. However, I know that if I do that, the family will be destroyed, because now years have passed since the incident. They have children, they have grandchildren, they are well known in the city, and spreading a rumor like that and forcing the grandfather to divorce, and he says there would be no way to force him to divorce without explaining the reason. That would send shockwaves throughout the community and would cause great disgrace and embarrassment to the children. And he said, therefore, I have to find a way to make sure that this is kept secret. So he's not going from the halakha to reality, but rather from reality to halakha. He says, in reality, we cannot tell the husband that this is what happened. And remember that I said this something happened in the past. So he goes through the halachic material on the matter. His main discussion is a concept called kavod habriot, the dignity of human beings. And he asked the question whether he can remain passive in not divulging information to the husband in order not to transgress the obligation to treat people with dignity. Then he comes to the conclusion that since you have here three people involved in this whole story, three people who are either know or impacted by it, himself, the rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Haim, the Ben Ish Hai, knows of the incident, knows of the adultery, but is not involved in a physical act right now. Meaning he's not part of the equation. The woman, the adulteress, knows what happened and is involved if she's physically living with her husband. The husband doesn't know, but is physically involved. So each one of them is a different status. And finally, he comes to the conclusion, and this is about whether that it's important, because we're trying to figure out whether saying or not saying is considered a passive act or an active action, which is more severe. However, he comes to the conclusion that to confirm an act of adultery, you need two witnesses, and you don't have two witnesses. Even though the story of the man seems reliable and that he confesses wholeheartedly, says we still cannot take it as a testimony. There's no reason that I would believe him. I can believe him for the purpose of teaching him how to repent, but not more than that. And he says, and with all that, the suspicion can still remain that he is trying to do that to frame the woman. So there's no reason why I should trust him, and therefore he says he decides to teach him a way of repentance, but not to divulge the information to the husband. And that's especially interesting because there's a similar teshuvah, and one that he himself refers to, a similar discussion, by Rabbi Yehezkel Landa of Prague, the author of a book called Noda B'Yehuda. Rabbi Yehezkel Landa of Prague had a similar question, a little more complicated, because in that case, the adulterer, the man who committed adultery with a married woman, ended up becoming her son-in-law, and he married her daughter. So now this whole family is intertwined, and just as in the case of Rabbi Yosef Haim, they already had children and grandchildren, that they're a prominent family, very righteous and well known, all Talmidei Chachamim, studious people, which is, by the way, just in parenthesis, it's interesting to know that, to know the realia, to know the reality of life in the past, because we always have this nostalgic view where people tell you in the past everybody was righteous, the community was amazing, and everything was beautiful. Not true. Those things always happen. The question is how much people were able to sweep them under the rug, and how comfortable they were with going out and telling them. In the case of the Noda B'Yehuda, however, even though it was clear to everyone involved that the husband and the wife, the husband who was betrayed and his wife, the adulteress, are no longer active in their marital life. They were in their 80s. The Noda B'Yehuda ruled that they must get a divorce, and he did not care about the repercussions of how that will affect the family. So I think this is a classical example of a different ruling between, but not necessarily an Ashkenazi rabbi and a Sephardic. In this case, it's an Ashkenazi rabbi and a Sephardic rabbi, but between a case that is almost the same, and the point of view of the rabbi. How do you approach the question? So the Ben Ish Chai approaches the question from the point of view of the family. He says, I must save the family's grace and honor, and therefore I will try to look for every possible way or any breach or any gray zone in the law that will allow me to do that. And the Noda B'Yehuda, Rabbi Haskalanda, on the other hand, says, this is the halakha, this is what we must do, I don't care what happens as a result. So those are some of the important halachot that the Ben Ish Chai issued. One more, and I go back 1 second to the issue of the bicycle. Some people argue that he changed his mind at an old age, and he regretted his ruling and decided that it's forbidden. And this was like an urban myth that was spread by ultra-Orthodox rabbis in the 20th century, because they didn't like the fact that some people ride bicycle on Shabbat. But when those people referred to the Ben Ish Chai, they had nothing to respond with. So they said he changed his mind. And the one who defended that opinion, meaning rejected the argument that the Ben Ish Chai changed his mind, was Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who said that a rabbi so prolific and knowledgeable as the Ben Ish Chai would not have let a change of mind go by unnoticed. I mean, if he really changed his mind, he would make sure that those who heard him will publish it right away. However, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef himself concludes that we should not ride bicycle on Shabbat because of minhag, of a practice. So, just interesting how this little detail is. I call it a little detail, but it's one. It affects a lot of people in the way that they could move on Shabbat and go from place to place. And here you have a rabbi that clearly explained that there's no problem, and this is not just an obscure rabbinic figure. This is a prominent rabbi, prolific author, who wrote more than 70 books, and that everybody follows, at least in one way or another, his halachic or spiritual writings. But when there is something that people don't like, they will find a way to reject that, and that is a sad part of how halakha evolves. Revital, you have a question?
It's more a comment than a question. It's very disturbing to me, and I also read that in one of Tzvi Zohar's books, who clearly tells about instances that he knows for a fact that a certain text in the original contained a certain leniency that was then wiped out by the Orthodox that published or republished
Yeah,
text and dissent.
100%.
There's what disturbs me is how can you? It's like fake news.
Yes.
It's
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, it happens. It happens. It is less common today because we have the means, like when someone writes today, and people misquote him. It's easier to find out that what was the original text. But back then, when you take a manuscript and you transcribe it and print it, if you change something, nobody would have known. You have to really go and you can't just copy and paste a whole paragraph into Google's search engine, right, and find out that it's done. I'll give you two examples to see how that one is discoverable, one is not. The two other things that were changed from the writings of the Ben Ish Chai is regarding the question of wearing tzitzit, the small tzitzit under the garment, and whether the fringes should be out or in, and also shaving the beard and shaving the sideburns. That a certain publishing house by the name of Ahavat Shalom in Jerusalem, led by Rabbi Hillel, when they reprinted the books of the Ben Ish Chai, they changed those rulings to fit their understanding of Halakha, according to which you must wear a tzitzit with the fringes outside your garments, and you're not allowed to shave. One is not allowed to shave his beard or his sideburns. So another leading scholar who was more in the line of the Ben Ish Chai wrote a book in which he proved how the texts were distorted. So someone from the publishing house, one of the people who distorted the writings, reached out to that rabbi and said, I regret writing what I did, and can I see what you wrote? I heard that you wrote a booklet. Can I see it in order to amend the situation? And I heard it from the rabbi who wrote the response, right? So he gave it to him. He believed that he's really going to change it. Instead, he used the material to argue his point further and to pretend that he's the one who saved the writings of the Ben Ish Chai. That's one. Another example, which is maybe less extreme, but is very typical to that idea of the fake news, is I would call it taking things out of context or just omitting certain important words. So one example is Herman Wouk wrote a book called My God, or This Is My God. I think that's the name of the book. This Is My God, and he wrote how at one point he was producing a play in Broadway and working very hard, and he describes his Shabbat, how as an Orthodox Jew he would leave the theater with all the mess and the stress and coffee cups and cigarettes strewn all over, and drive home and spend the Shabbat with his children. A beautiful, beautiful description. Now I read that as a kid in Israel in a magazine called Nitzotzot, and I love the description. He describes how when after the Sodat Shabbat, they would start the discussion, and the books would pile up on the table. Years later, I wanted to write an article about Shabbat, and I remember that text that I read decades ago, and I didn't know where exactly to find it, so I started Googling, and from here to there, I didn't find the original text, but I found a quotation of the text in a Lubavitch website. So I was very happy that I found it, and as I scrolled through the text, I realized that something is missing. That what I remembered from the original text now is not there. And maybe someone else would not have remembered it, but those were really the things that sparked my interest to begin with. So I noted that they were missing. What was missing? In the original text, Wook wrote, the books would pile on the table, the Torah and the Bible and the books of Halakha, atlases and encyclopedias. But in the Lubavitch version, the atlases and the encyclopedias were expunged. So once I saw the Lubavitch website, I said, is something wrong with my memory or with the website? So I went and I got the actual book and I found the phrase and I realized that they doctored his text. So it's done all the time. You have to be extremely careful. And this is just one example that is in modern time. With the internet, it's easier to find. I want to give a couple more examples because it's extremely important when we speak about research of halakha or history. When the Belzer Rebbe, the two rabbis of Belz, Rabbi Rokach and his brother, left Hungary to go to Israel in 1943, they gave a speech to their Hasidim who were left behind. And they said that they promised him basically that if they stay in Hungary, everything will be perfect. Don't worry, we're just going to travel to Israel. We're going to come back. But they knew what was going to happen. Years later, when the Hasidim printed the speech, they omitted this whole line and instead wrote in parentheses, here the Rebbe spoke of how much he wants to go to Israel. That's it. Another example, when the machine matzah were first brought to Eastern Europe, there was a very strong debate about it, and rabbis from both sides wrote insults and accusations against each other. But when it was reprinted in Israel by the followers of the rabbi who originally was against the machine, they omitted all that to clean the text. Now, the most ancient example that we have of that, I think, is a mention in the Talmud that the rabbis were contemplating, the rabbis, I'm thinking about the sages of the Mishnah, or a little before that, maybe 2nd, 3rd century before the Common Era. The rabbis were contemplating burying the book of Ezekiel, the book of Yehezkel, because there were certain things in the book that contradicted the halachot of the Torah. Eventually they were able to defend it, but they were also considering, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes has problems, Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, had problems. Now, we are only told of those books who made the cut, that they had doubts about them, but there were other books called the Apocrypha or the external books that didn't make it, and there were others probably who were lost. And finally, if we're already at that period, Professor Kahana of Hebrew U, who was Menachem Kahana, was an expert on Midrashei Halakha, he believes that besides the two famous schools in Midrash Halakha, that of Rabbi Ishmael and that of Rabbi Akiva, there was a third school of Midrash that was also expunged from the books. And one of the interesting and probably highly applicable to our days midrashim of that school of thought that has been forgotten is that women could also serve as witnesses, because there is no basis to argue that women cannot be witnesses. I mean, that is how the Talmud interprets that, because the Torah says that you need two anashim to be witnesses, but that particular Midrash Halakha, which was erased from the books, argued that anashim, or the masculine, is the default option of the Hebrew language, and it doesn't mean that is men particularly and not women, which makes a lot of sense when you think of it, because why would you let a murderer escape just because the only witnesses who were there were women? It makes no sense. Anyway, that phenomenon of books being text being doctored and the change has always existed. I think Professor Shalom Spiegel was one of my professors in Hebrew in Bar Ilan University, wrote about that. He has two books called, let me see if I have them here. Yeah, this is the book. It's called Yaakov Spiegel. Sorry, Amudim Betoldot HaSefer HaIvri. Speaks about how books were written, and in the first volume, this is the first volume. The second volume is about omissions and distortions, etc. Okay, let's go back to the to our list of rabbis. We only spoke of two so far, but there's such, each one of them is a whole world. Rabbi Yehuda Fetaya, this is the proper pronunciation. Rabbi Yehuda Fetaya, I spoke about him, was my great grandfather, and he didn't write extensively on halakha. It was mainly his written works are on Kabbalah and also interpretation of the Torah, of the moral teachings of Pirkei Avot. But him I know personally, not personally, but through my grandfather, who was my mentor, and I've learned a lot from the stories and from the practices of my grandfather, and that is something that I think is important, that one cannot achieve from reading books. In the book, you find a certain distilled information that the author wants to transmit. You find more from the books of responsa. We spoke about that. That in when you see the halachic discussion, the back and forth of bringing up the case and analyzing it and looking at the different points, different factors and the point of view of the rabbi, you learn a lot about the time and the social context and also the attitude of the rabbi to addressing the halachic problem, like we just saw with the Ben Ish Hai. So when you have the living transmission, just as in my case with my grandfather, through his father and through 9 generations before that, I've learned from him a certain approach to the religious leadership, and that is not. And it's important to know that it's not that I have to follow everything he said or everything that my great grandfather said, but rather I should have the ability to think what he would have said had he lived today and had he known what is happening today. That is the idea. Meaning, I need to use his tools and apply them to today's reality. Cannot be stuck in the past. And his tools, like the beliefs, the most important concepts that I've learned from him, were as follows. One, there was a tremendous emphasis on kavod habriot, the dignity of human beings. In every halachic ruling, the human factor is factor number one. Today, in the dialogue that is happening within the Orthodox world about halakha, the people like to use the term meta halakha, and meta halakha, like the meta psychological or meta sensorial, are things that are beyond halakha or above halakha. And the way I grew and was educated, there's no room for that term meta halakha, because everything is part of halakha. We cannot say the feelings of a certain person who's going to be affected by that ruling are meta halakha, or how it is going to affect global relationships is meta halakha. No, everything is part of halakha. Everything we have to calculate as much as possible the impact of the ruling. I think I mentioned this example before, but I'll say it again. My great grandfather, Rabbi Yehuda Fetaya, once had a question brought to him by a young girl in Yerushalayim. She came with an egg, cracked egg, in a bowl, and she wanted to ask if there's a little dot on the yolk, whether it's blood, because according to the Shulchan Aruch, according to Halakha, if blood was found in an egg, you have to throw it out, because you assume that that's the beginning of life. Today, that most of the eggs that we consume do not come from organic farms, except for some places, there's no such concern. They're all sort of sterile eggs. But it was a serious concern back then, and I remember as a kid that we would see it very, very often in eggs that we would, crack. So she came with the egg, and the rabbi asked her. The question that he asked her was, "Where do you live?" And she told him where she lived, and he said, "Go back home and tell your mom that the egg is kosher and that you could use it." After she left, I don't know if someone had. My grandfather asked him, or he explained that. Why did he ask her where she lives? He wanted to know how much the family needed the egg. When she told him that she lived, I think about 10, 15 minutes walk from there, he said to himself, if a mother is willing to send her daughter for a half an hour walk for one egg, they can't afford to throw it away. And he said, in that case, I rely on the opinion that it's edible. And that's how he ruled. So that was the first factoring the human condition into the teshuvah. That's extremely important. So that was something that I've learned from him. Another thing that I've learned from him, which was very important, and unfortunately today is forgotten, is that a lot of the rulings, a lot of the halachic rulings that are based on Kabbalah, were never meant to be used by the public. They were meant only for individuals who are maybe at the highest level of mystical education. And when you apply them, when you use them widely by the community, first of all, they're not understood, they're misunderstood, they're not used correctly, and also they give people the fake notion that they are of a high level because they do something, but it is only external. It's not internal. And how can I I think I gave you this mashal maybe before. It's like he compared it to maybe someone who learns the manual of a car but never drove a car. So people who follows rulings of Kabbalah but never practice Kabbalah, never went deeply into Kabbalah in a way that it affects their life and changes their perspective, are really missing the point. And there are a lot of rulings that are based on Kabbalah that people follow blindly. And he said, this you don't have to follow. Also, it was the idea of teaching observance through being a role model and not by imposing, and letting people have some flexibility. And that is something that I particularly saw at during the Seder night, because at Leila Seder, in many families, and Leila Seder, around the Seder table, there's a lot of stress in what has to do with how much wine do you have to drink, and how much matzah do you have to eat, and how much maror. Especially in the Frum and Orthodox families, people obsess over these questions, and sometimes they really literally stuff their face with matzah in order to eat the right quantity. And I remember as kids would ask my grandfather, "How much matzah do we have to eat?" And he would say, "As much as you feel comfortable with, as much as you want." Now, the same with the wine. How much wine? Kama shata rotzeh, kama shano alecha. That you choose. Now, years later, and I always followed it, I felt that it's correct, but years later when I was writing a halachic, I started writing my halachic blog, and which I send every day, and I wrote the halachot of Pesach. I said to myself, okay, I know that my grandfather did the right thing, but I know that most people believe that according to halakha, it's different. So let me dig out and see why what he was saying was right. And sure enough, I found the halachic support for each and every one of his practices. But it was amazing for me to see that what I knew sort of like by tradition from my grandfather, and I would tell people, this is what my grandfather said. And they said, no, it's impossible because the halakha is not like that. But when I took the time and I did the research and found out that that everything that he did was his own practice based on what he saw from his grandfather, and that it was really rooted in halakha. So those are some of the things that I've learned from him. Also, another important thing that I've learned from him, and it was also related to what my for his father, was respect for women. We were going to study it when we do the course on women in Sephardic literature. Rabbi-ovadia wrote a special prayer to honor the foremothers, because in the traditional readings for the high holidays, what is called the Hakafot, on Simchat Torah and some of the Selihot, we always refer to Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, David, Shlomo. And Rabbi-ovadia felt that the mothers are neglected, so he wrote special tefillot to honor Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, and he incorporated them into the Siddur, and they are being studied until today. And one of them, Zechut Rachel, is a very, very touching, very powerful prayer that is really telling of the way he understood and respected the women in his life and women in general. So my grandfather also pushed for his granddaughters, my sister, to do bat mitzvah when it was not very common in Israel at the time in the 1970s, and that was another thing that I've learned from him. One more thing is the importance of general studies. His library had an extensive library, included literature, philosophy, poetry, history, and a very strong emphasis on history. And of course, because it was part of the Etzel underground, a lot of books that had to do with the history of early Zionism and the members of the underground. So that is Rabbi-ovadia and his son Hacham Shaul, my grandfather. Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Hai Uziel, very important personality in the modern Sephardic Jewish history. Rabbi Mark Angel wrote a book about him. I think it's called Divrei Shalom Ve'emet, or Peace and Truth. Yeah, it's available in English. Rabbi Mark Angel. Rabbi Uziel was the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel. But that's because he continued from 1939 when he was appointed till he passed away in 1953. Just a sort of a historical fact: the position of a chief rabbi in Israel existed almost 300 years before the establishment of the state of Israel, and the title was called Rishon LeZion, and it is still used for the chief Sephardic rabbi. The title that is used in Israel is Harishon LeZion. So you have, for example, the current one is Harishon LeZion, Rabbi Yitzhak Yosef. The reason that name was chosen is that the first rabbi that was offered this position in the 1700s by the scholars of Yerushalayim, they offered him the position of chief rabbi, and he refused. He said, "I cannot be a chief rabbi. You're all scholars." So instead of calling himself chief rabbi, he chose the term Rishon LeZion, the first of Zion, saying, "I just happen to be the first in line, but I'm not superior," meaning I'm first horizontally and not vertically. With the establishment of the state of Israel, there was a new position added, that was that of the chief Ashkenazi rabbi, and this is how it is still today. Every city and every locality has two rabbis, Ashkenazi rabbi and Sephardic rabbi, and it was the Sephardic rabbi, the chief Sephardic rabbi, Rabbi Bakshi Doron, who was, I think, three up. The one who served three rabbis ago, so to speak, who on the day that he was appointed as the government to change that dichotomous system and to have only one rabbi. He said it doesn't make sense that the state of Israel will have a chief Sephardic and a chief Ashkenazi rabbi. Why are we solidifying this dichotomy? A chief rabbi should be able, even if he follows one practice, should be able to answer and to teach all practices. And he said he's willing to quit, to resign, in order to make room for one rabbi only, let it be the chief Ashkenazi rabbi at the time. But they did not accept his offer, mainly because it would affect hundreds of other rabbis who get their salary from the government and work for all the different cities and municipalities in Israel, and they voted against it. They were not willing to lose that lucrative position, unfortunately. So Rabbi Uziel, you could read here in the text. There's a lot of material written about him. He wrote also extensively. He has a series called Mishpatei Uziel, Michmanei, Egyonei, books on Halakha, on history, on the judicial system. He was the first one who supported the right of women to vote in the 1920s, way before suffragists achieved that in America. Okay, we don't have much time to speak about the other rabbis, but it's important to look up the rabbis Ovadia Yosef, Rabbi Haim Ovadia Levi, and Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, who happens to be also very close to my great grandfather. His father was his disciple. So the one more thing, Rabbi Haim Ovadia Levi. We spoke about Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, so I'll speak a little bit more about Rabbi Haim Ovadia Levi. He was slated to become the chief rabbi of Israel, but eventually was pushed aside because of political considerations. He wrote extensively on halakha. Interesting worldview, because on one hand he's very considerate and flexible in his halachic writings, but he's also he also takes into account mystical teachings. He gives it a lot of importance and weight. One of his famous rulings is regarding euthanasia. And this is something that I already spoke about, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s, when he spoke about suspended animation, and he said that contrary to what people believe, there are situations where it is allowed to intervene, either to stop suspended animation or to not start with it, do not resuscitate, as it's called now, DNR. And he explained that the only information that we have regarding that is from the time of the Talmud, where the methods that they had to extend one's life were very limited. They talk about, for example, someone who's keeping himself alive because he hears the anvil of the blacksmith next door. So the Talmud says the blacksmith must keep working, hitting the anvil, because that sound keeps that person alive. But we know very well that even if that was something that would keep that person alive, it would work for a day, for maybe a week. I don't even know if that is possible. But they didn't have the methods that we have today that could keep people for months and even years, sometimes on suspended animation, with situations that cause great sorrow to the family and to the patients. So he said it is not a blanket ruling that says that it's always forbidden. You have to analyze each case, and of course you have to take into account the human factor and speak with the family and make sure who makes the decision, but the possibility is out there. So that was one of his very courageous rulings that is extremely important. And I think we'll conclude with this teshuvah. There's always room to learn more about other great sages and other great hachamim. Hopefully we'll get there at a certain point. But with that, we'll conclude for now, and we'll take some time for questions on that. And I hope that we'll go back and analyze the life and actions and response of those great Sephardic hachamim.